My name is Sophia. I'm 34 years old, and I run a structural engineering firm that just signed a $12 million contract to retrofit 3 hospitals across the state. But 11 months ago, when I was wheeled into an emergency C-section at 2:41 a.m., drenched in sweat and terrified, not one person from my family answered their phone. Not my mother, not my father, not my sister, who I'd once given $18,000 to cover her rent when she was drowning. The only person who walked through those doors that night, the only person who held my hand while a surgeon cut my daughter out of me 11 weeks early, was a woman I wasn't even related to by blood, my mother-in-law Diane. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it still doesn't feel real to me even now. I was disowned by the people who raised me, and yet I was closing 7-figure deals within 18 months of that disownment. Dismissed as the difficult one, the cold one, the one who thinks she's better than us, and somehow, still, I was the one paying my mother's dialysis copays for 3 years before all of this happened. Let that contradiction marinate. It marinated in me for a long time before I understood what it actually meant. Here's the moment I want to show you, just a flash, before I take you back to the beginning. Picture a kitchen, granite countertop, a phone lying face down on it, my mother's hand hovering over it like she's about to pick it up and call me, and then pulling it back. Picture me, 7 months later, standing in my mother's doorway in a blazer that cost more than her monthly pension, holding a manila folder, saying 4 words that made my father sit down in his recliner like his knees had given out. I kept everything, Mom. That's where the story ends up. But it starts somewhere much quieter, much smaller, in a town most of you have never heard of. If you're watching this right now, do me a favor, drop a comment, and tell me where you're tuned in from, and what time it is where you are. I read every single one of them, even at 1 a.m. when I can't sleep because my daughter's monitor is buzzing on the nightstand. And if any part of the story starts to feel familiar to you, hit subscribe, because this channel exists for people like us, people who gave everything to a family that gave nothing back, and who are still, somehow, standing. Let me take you back to Millhaven Ridge, a town of about 14,000 people tucked into the hills of upstate Pennsylvania, the kind of place where everyone knows whose porch needs painting and whose marriage is falling apart before the people in it do. I grew up in a beige, split-level house on Larkspur Lane, the second of 2 daughters born to Carol and Richard Ashworth. My sister, Madison, was born 3 years before me, and from the moment I could understand language, I understood the hierarchy of that house. Madison was the golden one. I was the other one. It wasn't cruelty, exactly, not at first. It was smaller than that. It was the kind of favoritism that doesn't leave bruises, just absences. Madison got a used Honda Civic for her 16th birthday, cherry red, with a bow taped to the antenna, and my parents took 42 photographs of her standing next to it. I know because I counted them years later, going through an old photo album. When I turned 16 2 years later, I got a bus pass and a hug that lasted about 2 seconds. My mother said, "You don't really need a car, Sophia. You're so independent." She said it like it was a compliment. It took me another decade to understand it was a diagnosis of how little they thought I required from them. I was the one who got straight A's without anyone checking my homework. I was the one who got a partial scholarship to Penn State for civil engineering, a program with a 6% acceptance rate that year, though nobody in my family ever bothered to look that up. While Madison, who dropped out of community college twice, moved back into my parents' basement at 24 with $31,000 in credit card debt that my father quietly paid off over 18 months, $1,722 a month, money he told me they just didn't have when I asked for $400 to cover a textbook fee my sophomore year. I remember the exact moment I understood the shape of it, not just the feeling of it. I was 19, home for Thanksgiving, and I overheard my mother on the phone with my Aunt Denise in the kitchen, the smell of turkey and sage stuffing thick in the air. She said, "Madison just needs more support right now, you know how she is. Sophia's fine. Sophia's always fine. Sophia's always fine." For words that told me exactly how much room I was allowed to take up in that house. None. My needs weren't just deprioritized. They were assumed away entirely because I had made the mistake of being competent. I graduated in 2014, top 8% of my class, and took a junior structural engineer position at a firm in Harrisburg making $58,000 a year, which felt like an enormous sum of money to a girl who'd been living on ramen and a work-study stipend. Within 4 years, I was a licensed PE, and by 26 I'd moved to a mid-size firm called Corrigan and Vance Structural Group, where I was managing retrofit projects on aging school buildings across 3 counties. I want to be specific here because specificity is the only thing that makes any of this believable. By the time I was 28, I was earning $142,000 a year, and I had $61,000 saved in a brokerage account that I'd built dollar by dollar, missing vacations, driving a used Corolla with 143,000 miles on it, because I understood something my family never seemed to. Money doesn't appear. It's built, slowly, invisibly, by people no one is watching. That same year, I met Daniel Reyes at a project kickoff meeting in Allentown. He was a general contractor, 6 years into running his own outfit, sharp-jawed, quiet in the way that competent men often are, the kind of quiet that isn't insecurity but just economy of words. We were engaged 14 months later, married the following spring in a small ceremony at his parents' property outside Bethlehem, 60 guests, string lights, a caterer who did a mushroom risotto station that half our guests still bring up. My mother cried at the wedding, and for one afternoon, I let myself believe it meant something. It didn't, not in the way I hoped. It just meant she liked a good photo opportunity. Daniel's mother, Diane Reyes, was there that whole day in a way my own mother wasn't. Diane was 61 at the time, a retired ICU nurse who'd worked at St. Luke's for 29 years, a woman with silver hair cropped short and hands that had clearly done real work. She hugged me before my own mother did. She was the one who noticed my shoes were pinching and quietly handed me a pair of flats from her tote bag just in case, she said, like she'd planned for a stranger's comfort before her own son's wedding even started. I didn't know yet how much I would come to lean on that instinct of hers. Here's where the trigger event starts, and I want to walk you through it slowly because every piece of it matters. In February of 2023, my father, Richard, called me on a Tuesday night. I remember it was a Tuesday because I'd just gotten off a site visit at a middle school in Lebanon County, my boots still caked with mud, and I was eating cold leftover pad thai standing at my kitchen counter when my phone rang. He said Madison, now 37, had gotten in over her head with a boyfriend's failed contracting business and needed someone to co-sign a $94,000 small business loan to keep it afloat. Not a gift, a co-sign. My name, my credit, my liability, on a business run by a man I'd met exactly 3 times, for a company that hadn't turned a profit in 2 years according to the one balance sheet my father reluctantly forwarded me. I asked for 2 days to review the financials. My father sounded almost offended that I'd asked. It's family, Sophia. You don't need 2 days to think about family. I looked at those numbers anyway. I couldn't help myself. It's what I do for a living. I read structural stress reports for a living, and this business was structurally unsound in every sense of the word. Receivables that didn't reconcile. A debt-to-income ratio that would have made any underwriter laugh. I called my father back on Thursday night, 7:22 p.m., and I said the word that changed everything. No. Not I can't. Not, let me think about it more. Just, no, Dad. I've looked at the numbers, and I can't put my name on this. It's not a good loan, and I'm not going to pretend it is because it's Madison. The silence on the other end of that call lasted 11 full seconds. I counted them, the way you count contractions, because some part of me already knew something was starting that I couldn't stop. Then he said quietly, "You've always thought you were better than this family." I told him that wasn't true, that this had nothing to do with superiority and everything to do with math, with liability, with the fact that I had a husband and a mortgage of my own to protect. He hung up without saying goodbye. 3 days later, my mother called, not to talk about the loan, to tell me that Sunday dinner was canceled, and that maybe I needed some space to think about what family actually means. I didn't understand yet that this was the opening move in something much bigger. I thought it was a cooling-off period. I had no idea it was the beginning of a silence that would eventually stretch past 400 days. The rupture itself came 6 weeks later, at my parents' house, on a Sunday afternoon in April, the kind of gray Pennsylvania afternoon where the sky looks like a dish rag and the trees haven't decided if they're doing spring yet. My mother had invited me over under the pretense of just talking, and I walked into that beige split-level house for what I didn't know would be the last time in almost a year and a half. Madison was there. My father was there. And there was a manila folder on the coffee table that I recognized immediately as the loan paperwork, printed out, a pen resting on top of it like a prop in a play I hadn't agreed to be in. My father said, "We talked, and we think you should reconsider." For Madison, I sat down. I did not raise my voice. I said, "I already told you my answer." "It's still no." Madison, sitting on the arm of the sofa in a cardigan I recognized as one she'd borrowed from me 2 Christmases prior and never returned, said the line that I will hear in my head for the rest of my life. She looked at me, not with anger, but with something colder, something almost bored, and she said, "You've always been the one who thinks money makes you better than us. Must be nice to only care about yourself." My mother didn't correct her. My father didn't correct her. They just sat there, letting it hang in the air like smoke. I want to tell you what I did not do in that moment, because I think it matters. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend 12 years of quietly wiring money to that house, the $18,000 for Madison's rent, the $9,400 I'd sent for my mother's dialysis copays over 3 years, the $6,000 I'd covered for my father's truck repair the previous winter without a single thank you card. I simply stood up, smoothed my skirt, and said, "If that's really what you all think of me, then I don't think I need to be here." My mother said, "Don't be dramatic, Sophia." I said, "I'm not being dramatic. I'm leaving." And I did. My father called 2 days later, not to apologize but to inform me, in the flat tone of a man reading terms and conditions, that given my attitude, they thought it was best for everyone if I took some time away from the family. I asked him to clarify what that meant. He said, "It means don't call your mother right now. It means don't come to Easter." I said okay, and I hung up, and I sat in my car in the parking lot of my own office building for 11 minutes before I could make myself go back inside and finish a client call about seismic load calculations, my voice perfectly level the entire time, because that's what I've always been able to do, perform stability, even when the ground underneath me is doing something else entirely. If any of this feels close to home for you, go ahead and drop a comment. I promise you're not the only one who's had to sit in a parking lot and pretend everything is fine before walking back into a meeting. It was Diane who found me that night, or rather, Diane who Daniel called worried because I'd gone quiet in the way he'd learned meant something was actually wrong. She showed up at our apartment with a container of chicken and rice soup she'd made from scratch, still warm, and she didn't ask me a single question for the first 20 minutes. She just sat with me on the couch while I stared at the wall. When I finally told her what happened, she didn't say, "I'm sorry," the way people do when they don't know what else to say. She said, "You made a decision with your eyes open, and they punished you for having eyes." Something about the specificity of that sentence cracked something open in me, and for the first time in 6 weeks, I let myself cry, not from grief exactly, but from the strange relief of being truly seen by someone who wasn't even required to see me. Over the following months, Diane became something I hadn't had before, not even growing up in that beige house on Larkspur Lane, an adult who was simply, consistently on my side. She came to my ultrasounds when I found out I was pregnant that August. She sat with me in a waiting room in November when I had a scare at 24 weeks, holding my hand in a chair that smelled like hospital-grade disinfectant and stale coffee, while my own mother, 31 miles away, didn't even know I was pregnant at all because we hadn't spoken since April. By the time I was 6 months along, I had made partner track progress at Corrigan and Vance, been handed my first $1 million-plus project independently, a courthouse retrofit in Reading with a $1.4 million contract value, and I had exactly one family member who knew any of it. Diane knew about the promotion before my own mother knew I was carrying her granddaughter. That's the strange arithmetic of estrangement. It doesn't erase the people who left, it just makes room for the ones who show up. I didn't know yet, standing in my kitchen that winter, 8 months pregnant, running my hand over the curve of my stomach while Daniel worked late on a job site, that the actual test of all of this, the real rupture, the one that would define the next year of my life, was still 11 weeks away. I didn't know that at 2:41 in the morning, my body would make a decision my family wasn't there to witness, and that the woman who caught me on the other side of it would be someone who'd married into my life rather than been born into it. I didn't know yet how much that single fact would end up costing the people who were supposed to love me first. But I was starting, slowly, to understand something that would take root over the next 2 years and eventually bring me back to that beige house with a folder of my own. Silence isn't always punishment. Sometimes silence is just the sound of people finding out, very slowly, what they actually lose when they let someone go. Year 1 of the silence didn't feel like a year. It felt like a hell breath. I gave birth to my daughter, Eleanor, at 2:41 a.m. on a Thursday in late January, 11 weeks early, after a placental abruption sent me into emergency surgery so fast that the consent form was still damp with my signature when they wheeled me back. Daniel was on a job site 40 minutes away when my water broke, stuck behind a jackknife truck on 78, and by the time he called his mother in a panic, Diane was already grabbing her keys. She made it to St. Luke's in 18 minutes. My own mother, 31 miles away, didn't pick up her phone. Neither did my father. Neither did Madison, though I hadn't really expected her to. Diane sat in a vinyl chair in a hallway outside the NICU for 6 hours, still in the cardigan she'd thrown over her pajamas, while a team of people I'd never met kept my daughter alive in an incubator the size of a bread box. When I woke up from anesthesia, groggy, terrified, asking for someone before I even knew who I was asking for, it was Diane's face I found first. She held my hand and said, "She's small, but she's a fighter, just like her mother." I didn't cry then either. I was too tired, too hollowed out, but I remember thinking, with a kind of cold clarity that surprised me even in that state, that I would remember exactly who was and wasn't in that hallway for the rest of my life. My mother texted 2 days later. Not a call, a text. It said, "Heard you had the baby early. Hope everything is okay." 11 words. No punctuation urgency. No mention of a name, because she didn't know Eleanor's name yet, because nobody had told her, because I hadn't been ready to let her back into a room I'd finally built without her in it. I didn't respond for 6 days. When I did, I wrote back 4 words. "She's stable. We're managing." I didn't invite her to visit. She didn't ask to come. That was the shape of year 1. Not screaming matches, not slammed doors, just this low, persistent hum of absence, punctuated occasionally by a text so brief it felt almost performative, like she was checking a box marked attempted contact for reasons that had nothing to do with me. My father sent nothing at all for the first 4 months. Madison sent a single Instagram comment on a photo of Eleanor that Daniel had posted, a heart emoji, nothing more, and then unfollowed me 2 weeks later. I only knew because a mutual cousin mentioned it at a barbecue that summer, half laughing, like it was gossip, and not the quiet erasure of the last visible thread between me and my sister. I started keeping things that year, almost without deciding to. It began practically. I saved the text from my mother because I didn't trust my own memory of the exact wording, and something in me, some structural engineer's instinct for documentation, for load-bearing evidence, told me I'd want it later. Then I saved the next one. Then I started a folder on my laptop, then a second email account just for forwarding anything relevant. Then, eventually, a physical binder, black, 3 inches thick, that I kept in the bottom drawer of my home office desk. Screenshots of texts, printed emails, a voicemail from my father in March, 41 seconds long, that I transcribed word for word onto an index card and slid into a plastic sleeve. I didn't know yet what I was building toward. I just knew that if I was going to carry the silence, I wasn't going to carry it as a blur. I was going to carry it as a record. Diane, meanwhile, became something closer to family than family had ever managed to be. She came over every Wednesday with groceries she pretended she'd just happened to have extra of. She taught me how to do kangaroo care with Eleanor during the 6 weeks she spent in the NICU, sitting beside me in that unit at odd hours, both of us reeking of hospital hand sanitizer, while machines beeped their steady rhythms around us. When Eleanor came home at 4 pounds 2 ounces, Diane was the one who showed up with a portable oxygen monitor she'd researched herself, a leftover instinct from 29 years of ICU nursing, because she didn't trust the hospital's discharge instructions to be thorough enough. She was right not to. It caught a dip in Eleanor's oxygen on only the second night home, and we were back in the ER by 4 a.m. My mother found out about that hospital visit 3 weeks after it happened, from Daniel's cousin at a wedding shower. She texted me that time, too. "Why didn't you tell me?" I wrote back. Why would I? She didn't respond to that one. Year 2, the silence took on a different texture. It stopped feeling raw and started feeling almost architectural, like something I could build around instead of something bleeding through the walls. I made senior structural engineer at Corrigan and Vance in October of that year, a title bump that came with a salary jump to $168,000 and lead responsibility on a $6.2 million school district retrofit spanning 4 buildings in Lebanon County, the kind of contract that, 3 years earlier, would have gone to someone 15 years my senior. My managing partner, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Priya Okafor, told me flatly in my review, "You have the calmest hands under pressure I've seen in a decade, Sophia. Use that." I wrote that line down in the same binder where I kept my father's voicemail, though I didn't examine too closely why those two things belonged in the same place. If you've ever had to build a career and a life quietly, without an audience cheering you on, without a mother calling to ask how the big project went, you know there's a specific kind of loneliness in success like that. It doesn't announce itself. It just sits there next to you, while you sign contracts and attend site walkthroughs and pick your daughter up from daycare, and there's no one on the other end of a phone call who's been waiting 15 years to hear that you did it. Daniel celebrated with me. Diane celebrated with me, showing up with a bottle of sparkling cider because Eleanor was still nursing and she didn't want to seem like she was drinking without me. But there's a particular kind of validation only a parent can give, and mine had made it very clear I would be living without it. That same year, Madison had her second child, a boy, and I found out through a graduation announcement. Not hers, a friend's daughter's, that had somehow ended up C-seat with half the extended family, Madison included, her new baby's name mentioned in passing in a group thread I wasn't technically supposed to see but had access to because of an old family email list nobody had bothered to update. I sat with that for a long time. A nephew I would probably never meet. I didn't cry over it, not exactly. I just added the screenshot to the binder and closed the laptop. Around month 19 of the silence, my father sent the only substantial piece of communication I received all year, a birthday card for Eleanor's first birthday, mailed to my old apartment address, even though we'd moved 8 months prior, forwarded to us 3 weeks late by the new tenants. Inside, in his handwriting, small and cramped the way it always was, he'd written, "Hope she's doing well. Your mother thinks about her. Not, I think about her. Not, we miss you." Just a second-hand sentiment, delivered like a memo. I photographed the card, front and back, and put the physical copy in the binder too. If this is hitting close to home for anyone watching, that particular kind of half-effort, the kind that lets someone say I reached out without ever actually reaching, go ahead and drop a comment, because I promise you're not imagining how much that stings. By the end of year 2, Corrigan and Vance had put my name on a proposal to lead a new division focused entirely on hospital and school seismic retrofits, a division that, if it landed the pipeline of contracts Priya believed it could, would be worth an estimated $9 million in annual billings within 3 years. I was 32 years old, raising a daughter who'd started calling Diane Nana D before she'd ever met my mother, running a professional life worth more on paper than either of my parents had built across their entire careers combined. And still, some small, stubborn part of me kept the porch light on, metaphorically speaking, kept checking my phone on Sundays out of an old, worn-down habit, kept a version of hope alive even as I filed away every scrap of evidence that hope wasn't being reciprocated. The seed of what would eventually pull my family back into my life was planted almost by accident in the spring of that second year, in a way so small I didn't register its significance at the time. A regional business journal, one of those glossy quarterly publications aimed at local chambers of commerce, ran a feature on 40 under 40 professionals reshaping infrastructure across the Lehigh Valley and surrounding counties. I was included, alongside a photo of me in a hard hat on the Reading Courthouse site, a caption noting my role leading the firm's new $9 million seismic retrofit division. It was a modest piece of regional press, the kind of thing I assumed maybe 11 people would read, mostly colleagues. I didn't share it anywhere myself. I've never been someone who posts about my career online. It's felt, since childhood, like something that would only invite more scrutiny, more comparison, more of that old refrain. Sophia's always fine. But Daniel, proud in the quiet way he always was, shared it once on his own social media, tagging me, writing 3 sentences about how proud he was of the mother of his daughter. He had 340 followers. One of them was a woman named Renata Fields, a distant cousin on my mother's side who I hadn't spoken to since a family reunion nearly a decade earlier. Renata, it turned out, still had my mother on a group chat with roughly a dozen extended relatives, the kind of loosely maintained family thread that exists mostly to share recipes and funeral announcements. I didn't know any of this was happening. I found out only much later, well into year 3, when Diane, who, unbeknownst to me, had quietly stayed in touch with a few people on the periphery of my family, mostly out of an old nurse's habit of keeping tabs on things, mentioned, almost offhand, over Sunday dinner, that she'd heard from a mutual acquaintance that my mother had seen the article. Not through me, not through anything I'd shared, through a distant cousin's screenshot in a family group chat, forwarded with a caption I never saw directly but that Diane, with characteristic bluntness, summarized for me exactly as she'd heard it. Renata said your mother went quiet for a full day after seeing it, and then asked whether the retrofit contract Daniel mentioned was really worth what the article said it was worth. I want you to notice what that question was, and what it wasn't. It wasn't, is Eleanor doing better since the NICU? It wasn't, how is Sophia holding up, all this time without us? It was a question about a number, about whether the $9 million figure printed in a regional business journal was accurate. That single detail told me more about what was coming than anything else could have. Somewhere in a beige, split-level house on Larkspur Lane, my mother was doing arithmetic, and I had a growing, uneasy feeling that whatever came next wasn't going to be an apology. It was going to be a plan. I didn't act on that feeling right away. I didn't reach out, and I didn't brace for anything specific. I kept building. The division launched that September. We landed our first standalone contract within 6 weeks, a $2.1 million retrofit on a regional hospital wing in Allentown, and Eleanor turned 2, healthy, loud, obsessed with dinosaurs, utterly unaware of the quiet architecture of estrangement she'd been born into. Diane kept showing up every Wednesday. The binder kept growing, thicker now, organized with tabs I'd added myself. Texts, calls, cards, financial history. I didn't know yet exactly what I was preparing evidence for. I only knew, with the same instinct that tells me when a support beam is bearing more load than its rating allows, that something was shifting in the distance, and that when it arrived, I wanted to be the only person in the room who wasn't surprised. The first direct contact in nearly 2 years came on a Tuesday afternoon in October, year 3 of the silence, in the form of a text from my mother that read nothing like the clipped, dutiful messages I'd grown used to. This one had warmth stapled onto it, warmth I hadn't earned back and hadn't asked for. Hi, sweetheart. I know it's been a long time, and I think about you and Eleanor every single day. I'd love to see you both. Can we talk? I read it twice, standing in my kitchen, Eleanor babbling at my feet over a plate of cut-up strawberries, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not hope, exactly, but a kind of clinical curiosity, the same feeling I get walking into a building I suspect has a structural problem before I've even opened the inspection report. Something about the timing. Something about the word, sweetheart. A word she had not used with me since I was maybe 11 years old. I didn't respond immediately. I sat with it for 4 days, which I know now, looking back, was exactly the right amount of time because it gave Diane a chance to bring me something I wouldn't have found on my own. She came over that Friday with a lasagna, unprompted, the way she often did when she sensed something was sitting heavy on me, and while Eleanor napped, she told me, carefully, that her friend Carolyn, who still played bridge with a woman named Ruth Pemberton, my mother's oldest friend, had mentioned something odd at their last game night. Ruth had let it slip that my mother had been asking around about how these engineering firms work, and whether seismic retrofit companies were the kind of business that could go public or get bought out. Diane relayed this to me flatly, without embellishment, the way she relayed everything, but I felt the floor tilt slightly under me anyway. My mother wasn't asking about my daughter. She wasn't asking about me. She was asking about acquisition multiples. I called an attorney the following week, a woman named Patricia Kemelu who specialized in family estate and asset protection law, recommended by Priya, my managing partner, who'd needed similar counsel herself years earlier during a messy divorce. I sat in Patricia's office on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Allentown, my binder, now 4 inches thick, resting on my knees like a shield, and I told her everything. The loan request, the disownment, the silence, the NICU, the recent, sudden warmth. Patricia listened without interrupting, took notes in a tight, efficient hand, and then asked me a question that reframed the entire situation in a way I hadn't let myself consider directly. Do you have any reason to believe your family is aware of your net worth, or your firm's valuation, or any inheritance or estate planning you've done? I told her about the article, about Renata, about the bridge game comment. Patricia nodded slowly and said, I've seen this pattern more times than I can count, Sophia. Families don't usually reconcile because they've had a change of heart. They reconcile when the math changes. She helped me understand, over the next 2 appointments, exactly what my legal position was, that Daniel and I had, wisely, kept our assets and the firm's ownership structure clean and separate from any family entanglements, that Eleanor's college fund and our home were protected under a trust Patricia helped us formalize that November, and that if my parents or Madison had any designs on access to what I'd built, they would find very little purchase. I left her office that day feeling something I hadn't felt in 3 years, prepared. I responded to my mother's text 9 days after receiving it. I kept it short. We can talk. Sunday, 2 p.m. at my house. I didn't offer my parents' old dining room, the beige split level, the site of the rupture. I offered my own territory on my own terms, in a home she had never once set foot inside. She showed up not with my father, but with Madison, which surprised me, though it shouldn't have. They arrived at 1:52 p.m., 8 minutes early, in Madison's boyfriend's truck, the same boyfriend whose failed contracting business had started all of this, and I watched from my kitchen window as my mother smoothed her blouse in the truck's side mirror before walking up my front path, past the small maple tree Daniel and I had planted the spring Eleanor came home from the hospital. I opened the door before she could knock. The visit itself lasted 2 hours and 11 minutes. I know because I glanced at the clock on my mantel more than once, an old habit from site meetings where every minute has a cost attached to it. My mother cried within the first 10 minutes, real tears, or tears real enough that I couldn't immediately tell the difference, and said all the things I imagined she'd rehearsed in the truck on the way over. She said she'd made mistakes. She said she never should have let the loan situation come between us. She asked to hold Eleanor, and I let her, watching my daughter study this unfamiliar woman's face with the frank, unguarded curiosity only a 2-year-old can manage, completely unaware of the years of history sitting behind that moment like sediment at the bottom of a lake. But it was Madison who gave the visit away. Not through anything she said, through what she did. While my mother held Eleanor on the living room sofa, Madison wandered, slowly, almost lazily, toward my kitchen, running a hand along the edge of my quartz countertop, glancing out the back window at the detached garage where Daniel keeps his work truck and his newer pickup, a Ford F-250 he bought the year before once the business had stabilized enough to justify it. She asked, with a lightness that didn't match the weight of the question, "Is this place paid off?" I told her that wasn't really any of her business, and she laughed, a short, uncomfortable laugh, and said, "I'm just saying, you clearly landed on your feet." Landed on your feet, as if the last 3 years had been a matter of luck, of gravity, rather than 4 a.m. feedings and $6.2 million contracts, and a body that had been cut open at 2:41 in the morning while nobody but a mother-in-law showed up. My mother asked, almost as an aside, near the end of the visit, whether the firm I worked for was doing well with all these hospital contracts. I told her it was doing fine. She asked whether Daniel's construction business had picked up a lot since he went out on his own. I told her it had. She asked, finally, in the doorway, as she was leaving, whether we'd thought about setting up a college fund or anything like that for Eleanor in case something ever happened to us. I told her we had, and left it at that, watching her face carefully as I said it, the way you watch a beam under new load to see if the strain shows anywhere in the material. It did. Something flickered there, quick, calculating, gone almost as fast as it appeared, but I'd been trained by then, by Patricia, by the binder, by 3 years of documentation, to notice exactly that kind of flicker. The confirmation came 2 weeks later, and it came from an unlikely source. Daniel's phone, left face up on our kitchen counter one evening while he showered, buzzing with a text from his cousin Marcus, who had, coincidentally, gone to high school with Madison's boyfriend and still occasionally crossed paths with him at a gym in Bethlehem. The message wasn't meant for me. It read, "Yo, your wife's fam asking around about her business. said something about her being worth like 2 mil, you know anything? I stood there in my kitchen, dish towel still in my hand, and read it twice, and felt something settle into place with the quiet, terrible click of a puzzle piece you've been avoiding. I didn't confront Daniel about it that night, not out of any distrust of him, but because I needed to think. I called Diane the next morning instead, and she was quiet on the phone for a long moment before she said, carefully, I didn't want to be the one to tell you this, because I wasn't sure how to say it without sounding like I was trying to poison the well. But Carolyn mentioned last week, at Bridge again, that Ruth said your mother had been talking to a financial advisor about family wealth transfer strategies. I don't know what that means exactly, honey, but I don't like the sound of it. I told her I didn't like the sound of it either. I went back to Patricia's office that Thursday and laid out everything. The visit, Madison's questions about the house, my mother's comment about the college fund, the text on Daniel's phone, the phrase, family wealth transfer strategies. Patricia listened, unsurprised, and said something I've thought about often since. Families like this operate on a kind of institutional memory of who provides. For years, that role was yours, quietly, without acknowledgement. What's happening now isn't reconciliation. It's an attempt to formalize a role they've always assumed you'd play, now that they can see the shape of it clearly enough to try to attach terms to it. She recommended I have any future significant conversations with my parents either recorded, where legally permissible, which in Pennsylvania requires only one-party consent, or documented immediately afterward in writing while my memory was freshest. I started doing both. 3 more visits followed over the next 6 weeks, each one a little more transparent than the last in its intentions, though my mother never stopped performing warmth, never stopped asking to hold Eleanor, never stopped crying at what seemed to be, by the 4th visit, remarkably convenient moments in the conversation. My father came to the 3rd visit, the first time I'd seen him in nearly 3 years, and he looked older than I expected, grayer, thinner in a way that suggested either illness or simply time, and for one unguarded moment when he first saw Eleanor toddling across my living room floor, I saw something genuine cross his face, something that looked almost like grief for the years he'd missed. It didn't last. Within 20 minutes, he was asking about how retirement works for business owners, and whether Daniel's company had a succession plan. The scouting visit, the one that told me everything I needed to know, came in early December, when my mother asked to come by alone, just to talk mother to mother, while Daniel was at a job site and Eleanor was at daycare. She arrived a full 20 minutes early again, and this time, without an audience, without Madison's obvious clumsiness to draw attention, she was more careful, more thorough. She admired my kitchen renovation, which Daniel had done himself the previous year, and asked what it had cost. She noted, almost idly, that my car in the driveway, a 2-year-old Audi Q5, paid off in full the previous spring, looked brand new. She asked whether I'd started thinking about long-term care insurance, a strange question for a woman my age to be asked, until I understood, sitting with it later, that she wasn't asking about my long-term care. She was asking, in the only language she seemed to have left for asking, who would be paying for hers. She left that day with a folder of my old childhood photos I'd given her, a peace offering of sorts, low stakes, the kind of thing that costs me nothing and lets her feel the visit accomplished something soft and sentimental. But I stood at my window and watched her walk to her car, and I thought about Patricia's phrase, institutional memory of who provides, and I understood, with total clarity, that whatever came next wasn't going to be an apology delivered quietly over coffee. It was going to be a request, dressed up in family language, for money, or property, or access, or all three, and it was going to come soon, and it was going to come with an audience, because families like mine had never once done anything difficult without making sure there were witnesses to perform in front of. I texted Diane that night and told her what I suspected. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something I've carried with me since. You don't owe them the ending they're expecting, Sophia. You only owe yourself the ending you can live with. I sat with that in my kitchen long after Daniel had gone to bed, the binder open on the table in front of me, 5 inches thick now, organized, indexed, complete. I didn't know yet exactly what shape the confrontation would take, or which of them would be the one to finally say the thing they'd clearly been circling for months. But I knew it was close. I could feel it the way you feel weather changing before the sky confirms it, a pressure building somewhere just past the horizon. 3 days later, My mother called and said she wanted to bring the whole family over the following Sunday, my father, Madison, even Madison's boyfriend, to finally clear the air as a family once and for all. She said it like a gift she was offering me. I said yes, and as I hung up the phone, I walked to my office, opened the bottom drawer of my desk, and set the binder on top of my kitchen table where it would be waiting, closed, unassuming, on Sunday afternoon, for whoever finally worked up the nerve to ask me directly for what they'd clearly been circling for months. Sunday arrived cold and overcast, the kind of late autumn day where the light never quite commits to being daylight, just hangs there gray and flat over Millhaven Ridge and the surrounding hills. I woke early, before Eleanor, before Daniel, and made coffee in the quiet of my kitchen, the binder sitting closed on the table where I'd left it 3 days earlier, 5 inches of documentation waiting patiently for its moment. Diane called at 9 a.m., ostensibly to ask if I needed anything for the visit, but really, I think, to make sure my voice sounded steady. It did. I'd had 3 years to build toward whatever this day was going to be. They arrived at 1:47 p.m. My mother, my father, Madison, and Madison's boyfriend, whose name I'd learned by then was Kyle, all 4 of them filing into my living room with the particular stiffness of people who know they're walking into something but haven't agreed among themselves on how honest they're willing to be about it. Daniel had taken Eleanor to his sister's house for the afternoon, a decision we'd made together, quietly the night before, because whatever this was going to be, I didn't want my daughter in the room for it. My father sat in the armchair by the window, the one Daniel usually took, and my mother and Madison sat together on the sofa, Kyle hovering near the doorway like a man who understood he wasn't really wanted but had been brought along anyway, probably as reinforcement, probably because someone in that family believed a man's presence added weight to whatever they intended to ask of me. I sat across from all of them in a dining chair I'd pulled in from the kitchen, the binder resting on the small table beside me, closed, its black cover giving nothing away. My mother started with the script I'd already heard 3 times that fall, how much she'd missed me, how sorry she was for the misunderstanding around the loan, how she just wanted our family whole again before it was too late for any of us. I let her finish. I didn't interrupt, didn't correct the word misunderstanding, though every part of me wanted to. I'd learned, over 3 years and a 5-inch binder, that the people who escalate first usually reveal themselves first, and I intended to let this room reveal itself in full before I said very much at all. It was my father who moved things forward, clearing his throat in that particular way he used to do before delivering bad news at the dinner table when I was a child. He said that he and my mother had been doing some thinking about their retirement, that his pension from the plant hadn't kept pace with the cost of living the way they'd expected, that Medicare didn't cover everything they thought it would, and that they'd started looking into options. He said the word options the way a man says a word he's rehearsed but doesn't quite believe himself. My mother added that Madison and Kyle were still trying to get back on their feet after the business failure, that Kyle had found a new opportunity, this time a food truck venture, that needed just a bit of a runway, somewhere between $60,000 and $80,000 depending on the equipment. And then Madison said it plainly, the thing I think everyone in that room had been circling for months without quite landing on. She said, "We were thinking, since you're doing so well, and since we're family, that maybe you could help set something up. Like, officially, a family fund, or you could just add Mom and Dad to the house, or the business, something that makes sure everyone's taken care of. We're not asking for a handout. We're asking you to actually act like family for once." I want to tell you what that sentence did to me, because it wasn't rage, not immediately. It was almost relief. 3 years of documentation, 3 years of watching flickers cross my mother's face at the mention of my house, my car, my daughter's college fund. And here, finally, was the thesis of the whole visit, stated out loud, in my own living room, in front of witnesses who couldn't later claim I'd misunderstood. I let the silence sit for a moment before I answered, the way Patricia had taught me to, the way I'd learned in 11 years of client negotiations that the person who fills silence first usually gives something away. "You want me to add you to my house," I said, "and fund a food truck, because I've been disowned for 2.5 years, and now you've decided I'm family again." My father said quickly that disowned was a strong word, that they just needed space, that it wasn't personal. I reached over, then, and opened the binder for the first time, turning it not toward myself but toward them, laying it flat on the coffee table between us like a document being entered into evidence. I didn't raise my voice. I said, "I have the voicemail where you told me I needed to take time away from the family. I have the text where Mom said Easter wasn't a good idea for me that year. I have 3 years of records showing every dollar I sent this family before any of this happened. $18,000 for Madison's rent, $9,400 for Mom's dialysis copays, $6,000 for Dad's truck, none of which anyone ever thanked me for, and all of which apparently doesn't count as acting like family." My mother's face went pale in a way I recognized from childhood, the specific color she turned when she was caught in something and hadn't prepared a response for it. Madison, predictably, escalated instead of retreating, her voice rising, sharp, saying that I was keeping receipts like some kind of psycho, that normal people don't document their own family like it's a lawsuit, that I'd always been cold, and this proved it. Kyle, from the doorway, muttered something about how this is exactly why we didn't want to come here, which struck me as almost funny, given that he was the one whose failed business had started the entire chain of events 3 years earlier. I let Madison's volume rise and fall without matching it. I said, evenly, "I document things because I learned, a long time ago in this family, that if I didn't, the story would get rewritten later to make me the villain. I'm not interested in being the villain in a story I have 4 inches of paper proving I'm not. It was my father who broke first, and it wasn't defensiveness that broke him. It was something quieter, something that looked almost like fear." He put his head in his hands for a moment, and when he looked up, his eyes were wet, and he said, in a voice much smaller than the one he'd used to tell me, 3 years earlier, that I needed to stay away from Easter. "Sophia, I'm 68 years old, and I have $11,000 in savings and a mortgage that's not paid off, and I don't know what we're going to do in 5 years, and I am scared. And I don't know how to say that to you without it sounding like I'm just asking you for money." For one moment, in that admission, I saw the man who used to teach me to ride a bike on Larkspur Lane, before Madison's Honda Civic and the 42 photographs, before "Sophia's always fine" became the answer to every question about what I might need. I told him I believed that fear was real. I told him I was sorry his retirement hadn't gone the way he'd planned. And then I told him that fear didn't obligate me to hand over equity in a house he called me cold in front of, or to co-sign anything ever again for a business belonging to a man I barely knew, or to pretend that 2.5 years of silence could be resolved with a folder of loan paperwork disguised, this time as a family fund. I said, "You don't get to withhold love as a consequence, and then expect access as a reward once you've done the math on what withholding it cost you." My mother recovered her composure faster than my father had lost his, and reverted, almost instantly, to defensiveness, saying that I was twisting everything, that they'd never stopped loving me, that this whole conversation was proof I'd changed since marrying into that family, a phrase she said while glancing, unmistakably, toward the framed photo on my mantel of Diane holding Eleanor in the NICU. I told her, calmly, that Diane had been in a hospital hallway at 2:41 in the morning when my daughter was born 11 weeks early, and that none of the 4 people sitting in my living room had answered their phones that night, and that if she wanted to talk about who had and hadn't stopped loving me, that was the only fact that actually mattered. Madison stood up at that point, said something about how she didn't have to sit here and be lectured, and started toward the door, Cal following her, though I noticed, and I want to be honest about this, because it matters, that she paused at the threshold, just for a second, and looked back at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her face since we were teenagers, something that looked almost like the old, uncomplicated love a younger sister sometimes has for an older one before the world teaches her to compete with her instead. She didn't apologize. She didn't say anything at all. But she looked, for just that instant, like she understood exactly what she participated in, and it cost her something to know it. My father left more slowly, and at the door, he turned back and said, quietly, almost too quiet to hear, "I know we don't deserve to ask you for anything. I just didn't know who else to ask." I told him I hoped he and my mother could find a solution that didn't depend on repeating the same pattern with someone else's children someday. I meant it as a door left open, not a door slammed shut, and I think, from the way his shoulders dropped, he understood the difference. My mother was the last to leave, and she stood in my doorway for a long moment, the cold air from outside pushing past her into my hallway, and she said, finally, without the performance she carried through most of the visit, I don't know how to fix this. I told her that fixing it wasn't something that happened in an afternoon, that it would take more than a single conversation and more than an ask for money to undo 2.5 years, but that the door wasn't closed, not entirely, if she was willing to show up consistently instead of only when the numbers made it worth her while. She nodded, said nothing more, and left. I sat alone in my living room for a long time after they'd gone, the binder still open on the coffee table, the gray afternoon light shifting slowly toward evening outside the window. Diane called around 5, and I told her everything, and she was quiet for a moment before she said, "You did something today most people never manage to do. You told the truth without becoming the thing they always accused you of being." I've thought about that sentence more than almost anything else anyone has said to me in the last 3 years. In the weeks that followed, nothing resolved in the tidy way television makes you expect. My father called once, awkwardly, to ask how Eleanor was doing, and I told him, and it was a short, ordinary conversation, the first ordinary conversation we'd had in years. My mother sent a card, not asking for anything, just a photo of a garden she'd planted that spring, and I let that be enough for now, without pretending it erased anything. Madison and I haven't spoken since that Sunday, and I've made peace with the possibility that we may not because I've closed a door, but because some doors only reopen when the person on the other side decides to stop knocking with their hand out. What I know now, almost 3 years past that emergency C-section at 2:41 in the morning, is that family isn't a fact you're born into and required to honor no matter what it costs you. It's something built, deliberately, through who shows up in the hallway at 2 a.m., through who holds your hand without asking what it's worth to them, through who chooses you consistently instead of only when the math changes in your favor. I was disowned by the people who were supposed to love me first, and I built a life anyway. A career, a marriage, a daughter, a family of choice that didn't depend on their permission to exist. And if there's one thing I want you to take from this, it's that you are allowed to keep the receipts. You are allowed to require consistency instead of performance. And you are allowed to leave the door open for people without ever again handing them the keys to the whole house. If this story meant something to you, I'd ask you to do 3 things before you go. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Drop a comment and tell me which part of this hit closest to home. And share this with someone who needs to hear that silence isn't always the ending. Sometimes it's just the space where you finally learn your own worth. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. I'll see you in the next story.